And now something special on this week's edition of Sunday Morning Gospel. We're talking with Professor Michael Noll of Valdosta State University, a well-known community activist, and retired pastor George Bennett, an all-around citizen in Valdosta and Lowndes County, who is also very much involved. I thank both of you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
And for your willingness to share.
Thank you.
The Coalition for Peace and Justice. What does that mean?
The name for Valdosta Coalition for Peace and Justice was inspired by the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And that's why we decided to embrace the work of Brian Stevenson, who is the director of the Equal Justice Initiative, who has done so much incredible work in regard to aspects of racial healing, racial reconciliation, criminal justice reform, and other issues. So he was the inspiration to us, and his National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which just opened up in 2018, basically gave us the idea for the name.
Now, tell me what that means to you.
What does it mean to me? As a German, it means a lot to me because I've had my own struggles come to terms of my family's past, of my country's past. And as a citizen of this wonderful community, I do realize just how painful it is for my fellow community members, my fellow citizens in the United States to come to terms with their past. So I would like us to be able to learn the lessons that others have already learned and to apply them in the context of our own communities, because it is so essential for us to move forward.
George, what does it mean, Coalition for Peace and Justice, to you?
It is an organization that I need in Valdosta, Georgia, because of my history. And my history as a Valdosta native is the racism of our past in Valdosta, and how to reconcile this with the reality that I live in and have lived in for some time. I grew up in this community, was educated in this community, and in 1957, I lived in Germany. I was a student at our university. I was working in Germany with a research station testing soils, and the men that worked with me there were all former Nazis or children of Nazis. And the only view I had of Nazis were these awful, horrible human beings, and I found them quite human. And we would go out after work and drink our load of beer, and we'd get into our sculls. This is a racing boat that we get on the Weser River. This was a town called Nordenham in northern Germany. And we would row up and down the river. And I would row. These were human beings that had this horrible past. How could they, in 1957, just after the awful things that their parents and their families had done to other human beings, and how could they have done it to the Jews, my brothers and sisters in Valdosta, who were not enemies to me, who were not awful? And I was a Christian in Valdosta who went to my pastor and I said, you know, I'm not sure I believe in Jesus Christ. I became a minister. But what I was saying was I did not believe in the belief that my brothers and sisters had in this community, that once saved, always saved, that you could only be a child of God if you were a Christian who believed in the doctrine of Christianity. And my pastor said, you're not the first Christian who has raised that question. This is common among us. And I couldn't believe it. So my history was not only in Germany, but it was in Canada, where I was with men and women of color, Christians from all over the world, and we worked together. And the Christianity and the racism that I was taught in Valdosta was not livable in that context. So when I finished college, I received a scholarship to Boston University School of Theology so that I could follow in the footsteps of Martin Luther King Jr.
Who was the dean when you were there?
At Boston University, it was, I can't tell you. I don't remember. It would come to me, but I can't remember.
Were you aware of Howard Thurman?
Oh, absolutely. And I've met him. And not many people have.
No.
Now, I've not met Martin Luther King Jr.,
I did.
but I went to his school. I marched with the garbage collectors in Memphis when he was killed.
That was amazing. We were talking about that. I think Michael and I was there. It was my hometown, Jerry Worth. And a lot of people don't understand that it was Jerry Worth before it was Martin Luther King Jr.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We do not need to have only heroes. There's got to be those of us who sit on the curbs and who clap by the heroes. But all of us who sit on the curb and cheer on our heroes are just as important as the heroes.
That's so important because most of the men who carried those signs, I am a man, most of the sanitation workers in the city of Memphis that helped generate the energy that led to Dr. King coming there, they were sitting on the curb.
And I was sitting on the curb today with a sanitation worker in Valdosta, talking with him about, he was telling me his story. His mother's family came, the Evans family that he was a part of, his mother's family came from Valdosta. And they ended up in West Palm Beach. And his mother was from Valdosta. His father was from the Bahamas. And he is now back in Valdosta wanting to be a part of the health care system to deliver it in Valdosta. And so he's working on his education certification. That's happening right now in Valdosta.
There is hope.
There is.
And there is change.
There is a future.
Yes.
And the future is if we can do this together.
Mm-hmm.
I'm living in West Springfield, Massachusetts. My wife and I, Martha, to whom I have been married for 58 years, if you can believe that people can be married that long, and we're living in the ghetto, and I'm a pastor. I'm the youngest pastor in the big downtown congregational church. I'm the youth pastor, and we're living in the ghetto. And the man across the street who has a pickup truck, and our two little boys and my wife are out on the curb, and he turns to my wife and he said, "Would your boys like to ride in my pickup truck?" This man is African American. She's from Brooks County. You don't put your little white boys in the back of a black man's truck in Massachusetts.
How strange an experience.
And she did. And it changed her life. And from then on, he also had a farm outside of Springfield, Massachusetts. We started getting fresh green beans from the man in the pickup truck. And it humanized life for my wife from Brooks County.
Here's something I want to ask of both of you. First, Michael, I want you to, from your perspective as a native-born German, I want you to tie into what George said, and then I want to talk about where we put our humanity in order to live as we do.
The important thing in this is that you have to be honest to yourself. And honesty is really ultimately what gives us the ability to embrace our shared humanity, to be a member of the human race in the end. And my story may have started with the discovery that my grandfather was working as a locomotive engineer during World War II, and he actually transported people to concentration camps. No, that's not something he talked about. I never had the chance to talk with him about it because I only found out about it after he'd passed away in 1975.
To the death camps,
To
for the
death
most
camps.
part.
He transported people like cattle to death camps.
On the trains.
On the trains. He was already locomotive engineer during World War I. He was born in 1898, and he was learning his trade at that point. But he was a locomotive engineer working basically during the early 1940s. It started kind of in 1942 and then kind of reaches a climax shortly before the war comes actually to an end. And so he had a decision to make, and that's a decision I was reflecting on many, many times since I found out about it, and I discussed this with my students too. He was a father of 5 children, and at some point an SS officer basically told him, "You're going to transport these people to concentration camps." And he had a choice to make. Either say no, be shot right there on the spot and somebody else takes his job, or say yes and be able to go back home again to take care of your family. I've always asked myself that question as I've asked my students, what would you do? What would I have done in his position? And that shocking experience to realize that it's nice to do the tough talking, but at the end of the day, it's about survival too. But having to deal with that, the fears that are connected with the decisions we make on a daily basis, has taught me a lesson or two about also growing a heart that is ready to jump when you need to jump, when you need to take a step. But you also have to be always very careful, of course, of possible consequences when you have a family. If you're on your own, you may be courageous enough to do this. But if you have a family, it's a different story. And so in any case, that's where it started. But dealing with the Holocaust in Germany didn't directly take place in the first years after the war. There was a denazification process that had started, but it pretty much came to an end fairly quickly because the Cold War had emerged. And we, as in the Western world, needed Nazis, in a certain sense, to continue a matrix of power and organization in order to now fight the new enemy.
Yes.
It is not a surprise that you actually have, in the 1970s, actually, a UN General Secretary named Kurt Waldheim, who actually was a Nazi. And that only came out in the 80s. And so it took the German society a long time to come to terms with its past. And what really triggered that, I think, was the reunification of Germany in 1989, 1990, because that was the time when Germans had to think about their shared history, as well as a history that sort of separated them for 4 or 5 decades after World War II. To ask the question, who are we as Germans, as human beings?
East Germans to West Germans and vice versa.
Absolutely, because West Germans had a different experience living in the so-called free part of the world versus East Germans who were, for all practical purposes, part of the Soviet Union for a long, long time.
Yes.
And then comes the liberation, then comes the reunification, and then comes the process that we all need in our current context too, to confess, to self-reflect, to come to terms with your past, and then be able to move forward as a society with that knowledge of a painful history, but with that knowledge of having learned some lessons at least, so we can move forward as one, which is what we need to do here too.
When we talk about your grandfather's experience,
Right.
You say he had to make a choice, but I remember the last time we spoke about it, I said he didn't have a choice. It appears hypothetically that he did, but he really didn't have a choice. He didn't have a choice for your grandmother. He didn't have a choice for his children. He didn't have a choice for the future of Michael Noll.
Exactly.
And all that have come since you. Hypothetically, it's easy to exalt our morals.
Absolutely.
Hypothetically, it's easy to exalt my humanity.
Right.
But when the rubber meets the road today and decisions have to be made, they sing a song in the Baptist church, "Where do you stand? Who's on the Lord's side?" Where do you stand? Where is your humanity when it comes to reconciliation? Number two. Number one, how did the experience of your grandfather touch you, and what brought you to the Michael Noll that I know now?
The experience of my grandfather and having to make a decision ultimately, that was the only decision for him as being a father of 5 children, as being my grandfather, otherwise I would not be here, has taught me sort of like the similar lessons that I learned when I was watching not that long ago a production called Downfall, which is actually a production that depicts Adolf Hitler's last few months in the bunker in Berlin. What was so shocking about watching Bruno Ganz, who was an Austrian actor who just passed away a few years ago, he perfectly depicts frighteningly real depiction of Adolf Hitler. So perfect that for the first time I was able as a human being to see the humanity of a monstrosity called Adolf Hitler, which was deeply disturbing because it is so easy to simply separate yourself from evil. It's somewhere over there, and it's called Adolf Hitler, or it may be called somebody else's name, but that's not me. But then at that very moment, just like as I was reflecting on my own grandfather's experiences and that reality of having that a part of my family tree, made me realize we share humanity. And if we share humanity, I have those potentials to be as bad as Adolf Hitler was. I can kill, I can rape, I can disrespect. And once you realize that is part of who you are too, you as a human are weak, but you also have strengths. And you can only develop those strengths if you are aware of your weaknesses. And that's the kind of honest dialogue we also need to have in our community. We do know, I know people who have ancestors who were members of the KKK. And I have talked with people who have witnessed various acts of racism that are completely despicable from a human point of view, from a Christian point of view. Yet they haven't found the courage yet to self-reflect, to find that moment of bravery, to do away with the fear they still have, to honestly talk about it. And here's the important part. What my grandfather did, what a good friend's grandfather did here in the community, does not define me, does not define him. What defines us is what we do with that knowledge, to embrace that knowledge, to make it our own history, to say, like, yes, this is who we are too, and then take that and then reach out to the other side, to meet with the victims as a descendant of a victimizer or the other way around, to then have these conversations and say, if we are truly one human race, we must have the courage to have the kinds of conversations that will allow us to keep moving forward as a society. And that is ultimately the goal of the Valdosta Coalition for Peace and Justice, not to put anybody into a corner, to get everybody out of the corner and to sit at the same table and say, yes, this is what happened, and yes, my father did this, my grandfather did that, and I haven't been able to talk about it. But once you talk about, and this is what a confession is all about, very strong tradition in the Roman Catholic Church, you are able to lift the weight off your shoulders by confessing your sins, by confessing your silence, which is also a sin ultimately. And then you all of a sudden feel like you are able to walk, you're able to breathe, you can move forward and can say, we can do better. And that is what we as the Coalition for Peace and Justice here in the Valdosta, like many other communities, are trying to do just at this very moment. Because it doesn't matter if there are countless names, if you think about this. George Floyd may be on people's minds right now. At some point it was Trayvon Martin. At some point it was Emmett Till. At some point it was Mary Turner, and we forget. But this forgetfulness is basically almost like silence. It's not wanting to talk about it. But that's part of the German Remembrance Project, where I participated in this last year. I was traveling with this German artist, Gunther Demnig, who came up with an idea in the early 1990s and said, we need to insert the names of the victims of the Holocaust into our communities, so that when you walk through my hometown Neuwied, or if you walk through Cologne or Berlin, you have these little stumbling stones which are only meant to really trip you mentally. As you walk across the street, you see the names inserted into neighborhoods that will call on the names of family members who used to live in houses in, say, Market Street in my hometown, and were eventually taken out of their houses, put on a train, which my grandfather may have been driving, and then put into concentration camps. Because once you insert a name, like Emmett Till, like George Floyd, into the narrative that exists within our communities, you can no longer live in that state of denial of your history. You have to embrace that. You have to bring them back to life. You have to insert their dignity into the neighborhoods where they once lived and loved and laughed and shared meals and were neighbors.
As living souls.
As living souls, absolutely.
You know, I was thinking, it's so easy to reflect upon, to feel slavery, to feel lynchings as an African American. But when it comes to Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust, in some psychic way, we are separated and removed from that.
Yes.
When it involves African Americans and Africans just as much as it did the Germans and the Jews, even those who sympathized with the Jews, vis-a-vis the abolitionists. It's all the same story. It's about humanity, man's inhumanity to man, and reconciliation. It is indeed about repentance. It is indeed about confession. It is indeed about, simply put, cleaning up my mess.
Absolutely.
So that I can move forward and be blessed. I am a Baptist. Okay.
It shows.
George,
Wonderful.
does it show?
Love it.
Tell me about how your experience affects your humanity today. You and I have shared about what it was like growing up. I was thinking about you this morning and how near Southside High School in Memphis, when the neighborhood became integrated, how we threw rocks at the white kids that drove through the neighborhood and how they used to throw rocks at us. But then when we got on top, the new Centurions behaved just like the old guard. Talk to me, George.
We did the same thing in Valdosta. Billy and Johnny and I got in our cars. Now, I wasn't like Billy and Johnny. I didn't throw the rocks. But I filled water balloons, and we would drive through neighborhoods, and we would throw water balloons at the black children and the black adults. And it was as terrifying to be having water balloons thrown at you as it was to have rocks, because you didn't know what was coming at you. And I could do that because I was a good boy. But in fact, I am a terrorist. It's my heritage too. And I have owned that heritage and have all of my life and been troubled by it. In my community that I live in, which is a recovery community, we don't talk about confessing sins. We talk about making amends. How do we address the people that we hated? How do we address our wives and our children and our parents and our neighbors for the way we behaved while we were under the influence? And one of the things we say in recovery is that you make amends when it is appropriate to make the amends. And some of the amends that I have made in the last 40 years have taken decades to make. And when I am advising and working with other people in that community, I don't tell them to instantly make amends. I tell them to live the amends. The change in behavior is the main amend.
You know, it's easy as you say that. It's so easy to get honest mentally. It's so easy to get honest emotionally. But to get honest at a gut level is a totally different thing, and it requires a process.
Not only a process, it requires friends. It requires companions.
We have to have help.
We have to have help. I couldn't do this.
Neither could
The
I.
changes that I have made have not been by me.
No.
It was by going to Boston University and being influenced by Howard Thurman and the other professors that Dr. King had. It was in living a new life that was possible only because I had a wife and people around me who helped me. The other day, in some stuff that I sent to our 3 children, who now are in their 50s, about my work in Valdosta and my concern about racial justice that we're doing today. My daughter sent me a notice this morning. She said, "Dad, the universe is teaching us to love." Now, this is my 52-year-old child who lives in Colorado, who's teaching her daddy, saying, "Daddy, the teacher is the universe. And the universe is real, and it's teaching us to love."
How does reconciliation take place if justice is not achieved? How can justice be achieved if reconciliation does not take place? Is that possible?
No.
Or is there
Not possible.
is there a forgetting that happens, or is there a why don't you just move on, or is there a why don't you leave that alone? Is there a
But
why are
forgetting
you
is the
bringing that
enemy.
up?
Forgetting is an enemy. Reconciliation is the acknowledgement of our past. Unless we realize that the formation of the NAACP occurred partly because of the sacrifice of Mary Turner. And Mary Turner was murdered in our community, slaughtered, and her baby was torn from her body because she protested the sheriff who had her husband, and the sheriff system of that day, 1919, would take black men who were incarcerated and put them into work camps, not unlike the Nazi work camps. And they would go to the rich farmers around Lowndes County and Brooks County, and they would work for the farmer, for the businessman. And when Mary was murdered and slaughtered, there was glee by the newspaper people, the police, the rich farmers, and they danced because it was the best show they had ever seen.
Even in the clerical community.
Even the clergy were
Yeah.
doing it. Because the enemy is ego and wealth. And if there's anything going on in America right now, it's the manifestation in the President of the United States of ego and wealth. And the result of ego and wealth is killing.
There is a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof is destruction and death.
Yes.
The books say that in the book, Don't Lie.
We all have that. We judge the other. Every time we see somebody who's not like us, we're judging them. That's part of humanity too, our weaknesses. But I'd like to reach that point, and this is a painful process, and it reminds me a little bit on this movie Matrix. There's at some point, Neo wakes up and asks Morpheus a question. He asks Morpheus the question, why do my eyes hurt? And Morpheus simply replies, because you're using them for the first time. And I feel like that at times, that for the first time using my eyes and my ears and my other senses to finally understand the suffering, the challenges of the other, which is really part of the human race like I am, in the context of the United States of America. Me as a white father, or my wife as a white mother, will never have to worry about what our son or our daughter may do, or if they go shopping or just simply drive in a car or whatever they may be doing. We don't worry about them the same way an African American mother or father would, because of the realities of this systemic racism that is expressed in so many aspects of our community. There's this beautiful, powerful clip that the New York Times at some point published, and it's available, easily found online, called Conversations with My Black Son. And you have the various children, let me put it this way, you have the various parents who are reflecting on their experience of raising a black child, a black teenager in the United States. When I listened to that for the first time, which is probably about 6 or 7 years ago, I'm like, oh my God, I as a white parent never have to think about this. Like, I don't have to tell my kid how to behave when he or she is being pulled over, other than, well, you apparently were speeding, so just pull over. And
Yes,
you
sir.
get a ticket and then you pay for it.
Yes,
No,
sir.
there's a little bit more than that, because depending on how you react, there is a completely different set of experiences that may be connected with you being a black human being behind the wheel, being stopped on the side of the road. As a white parent, I don't have to think about this. So all of these are like experiences where I finally realized, and this was an eye-opening experience for me also in Germany, starting in the 70s, going into the 80s, to finally realize what the Holocaust really meant and how we are part of that as spectators, or as those who are literally actively carrying it out, like my grandfather did. And the same thing is also true for our society too. There is no more space for being silent. We have to speak up. We have to have these courageous conversations. We have to look each other in the eye and say, I'm sorry, Lee, that you had that experience. And I, as a human being, want to make sure that we learn from that experience so that you and I can walk down the street together, that you and I can drive in a car at separate times, and we don't feel like we have to worry about being treated differently, that we are equals. We can disagree, we can shout at each other, we can share meals, but we always are going to be equals. And this is where we need to be moving in this particular direction as a society.
So now that you have actually touched the matrix and you watched it move,
Yeah.
you began to use your eyes for the first time.
Absolutely.
It's an undeniable reality.
And it's both painful but also beautiful, because you can finally realize your own full potentials as in being a human being, as in seeing that there is so much beautiful diversity on this planet. The one good thing I got out of COVID-19, if you can say anything good about this, is that as a teacher, I was forced to stay at home, do online teaching, but me being forced to stay at home, I was working out in the garden a lot in the mornings, because I like gardening, I like horticulture, but it also gives me time for reflection. And I had this kind of like a spiritual moment where I was looking at all the flowering plants we have, and I saw all the pollinators go to flowers.
Ooh.
They didn't care whether or not the flower was red or yellow or orange. They didn't judge the flower based on the color of their petals. They only judged their flowers by the sweetness of their nature, by being there to basically, feed them. And so, and in a certain sense, we have that potential of seeing all these beautiful colors. We've always denied this to ourselves. Butterflies and bees don't care. They just want your nectar. They want your beautiful, sweet ideas of what life is about. We have to do the same thing as humans.
That's why an undeniable truth
Yes,
sets you free.
it does. And only the truth will set you free.
Ye shall know it, but you have to open up. You have to be honest, open-minded, and willing to first come into contact with it, embody it, and then be free in it. And then you can take the necessary, the required action.
And here is another important part. And another experience, I seem to be meeting people outside the YMCA a lot. Another individual who I truly appreciate, an incredible, highly educated woman in this community who I've considered a friend for a long, long time. We talked about racial healing and racial reconciliation, and as we also talked about a lynching memorial as part of that process of having to come to terms with your past. And the individual expressed her fear, basically, of having such a monument in the middle of our community. Because
Why in the world do we need a lynching memorial? Why would I want anybody to put up a statue that every time I drive by it, it's going to remind me they used to hang black people? Where? In this area. Why? We don't know. They just did.
Let bygones be bygones. That seems to be...
Why do I want to keep pulling a Band-Aid off of that scab? Why do I want to keep reopening that pain?
Well, the thing is, we're not going to be able to heal that scab if we're not able to expose it in a certain sense. And so if it wasn't for those stumbling stones reminding Germans as they walk through the pedestrian zones or through the streets in Germany that, yes, this happened. Others in the family that invited him to come to be part of that ceremony. That is this beautiful moment of humanity when you, as a child, as a teacher, as a descendant, realize somebody cares about what happened here. So it's not about, remembering just the brutality of humanity that we all have the ability to exercise. Is also the ability we have as humans to embrace that part of our history, to see each other finally as equal human beings, and with that pain embrace the sweetness of life as moving forward together.
Is that a part of the reconciliation, the healing that you see, George?
Absolutely.
How?
Not only have I walked through the concentration camps in Germany and saw the places where his grandfather took Jews to be executed. I've also lived through the Mary Turner experiences in Valdosta. I've done sculptures as an artist and paintings as an artist here in this community of Mary Turner. And I have lived all over this country, and it's not just this country. BBC has shown pictures of a statue of in a community in Bristol in the United Kingdom where the slave trader in the British Isles in the ships who brought the Africans over to the United States of America to live in this slavery system here, this Bristol English man's statue was torn down last week. And it has been replaced by an African-American woman. And believe me, that community, and this is 2020, is divided. It is painful to remember that the Brits participated in this too. I've been in South Africa. I have been where the statues in South Africa have been torn down of the founders of the diamond and gold fortunes that were made on the backs of South Africans. Still there, still being done.
Even today.
Even today.
Still happening.
2 miles down under South Africa, there are men digging the gold out of the ground, and the fortunes are still being made of gold and diamonds out of South Africa. And I've been gifted with the fact Jimmy Carter and I in South Africa and in other parts of the world have built homes out of the Habitat for Humanity projects. What a glorious life I've been able to live, because my object was not to make money. I could have, but I actually have a good basis. I'm a white man. I was educated. I have a retirement from my church. My wife has a retirement from school teaching. We have saved money. We live in a very nice community here in Valdosta. My next door neighbor is African American, and it bothers me every night that he leaves his lights on that shine into my house all night long. Why? When he moved into that house, he was harassed by my neighbors because he was black. And he still cannot release himself like I can to turn those lights off because he needs to know who is around his home. And I'm his next door neighbor. And so now, today, his lights no longer annoy me.
How do we heal?
That way, acknowledging our history.
How do we begin to forgive? How is it that we have not just annihilated one another?
We have, those of us who are not annihilating each other today have come to no longer separate our faith from our actions. The ego and the money leads to death. If we can come to see each other as human beings, as you almost always say, it is the fact that we are brothers and sisters. And the object of this world is not to make money. The object of this world is love, the universe that is teaching us love. That's what Mahatma Gandhi knew. That's what Jesus Christ knew. That's what he taught. And we have turned these teachers into religions, sadly, not to examples of how to live. So how do we do it? We live it.
Absolutely.
We live our amends. We live our amends.
There's nothing I can add to that. That's absolutely the truth.
I thank you both for teaching, for preaching, for being who you are, the living souls that you are, and sharing your truths. And hopefully this will be the first of many opportunities to bring about justice, reconciliation, and healing in this community. That's why I love that hymn, "A charge to keep I have, a God to glorify, who gave his son my soul to save and fitted for the sky, to serve this present age, not mama's age, not grandmama's age, this present age, my calling to fulfill. Oh, may it all my powers engage to do my master's will.
Thank you for teaching me for these past 20 years since I've been living in Valdosta, and you have been.
We know each other well.
We do.
God bless, man. Thank y'all so much.